My father sold my car and used the money for a couch with his new wife. That couch cost them everything. I bought my car with money I'd saved since I was 14, working at a grocery store, then a restaurant, then doing landscaping every summer. It took me 4 years to save $12,000 for a reliable car to get me through college and my first job. My father had laughed when I bought it, saying I should have gotten something flashier, but I wanted something that would last. He'd never helped with the purchase, never offered a dollar, just complained that it made him look bad when his kid drove something so basic. 2 years later, my father married Denise after knowing her for 4 months. She moved into his house with her 3 kids and immediately started redecorating everything. Every week something new had to go because it didn't match her vision. The coffee table was wrong, the kitchen chairs were outdated, the living room needed a complete makeover. My father went along with everything, maxing out credit cards to keep her happy. When I came home from college for spring break, my car was gone from where I'd parked it in his driveway. I asked where it was and he said he'd had it towed because it was leaking oil. I checked the driveway and there was no oil stain. I called the tow company, and they said they'd taken it to an impound lot per the owner's request. The owner being my father, since I'd made the mistake of putting his name on the title for insurance purposes when I was 18. I went to the impound lot, and they said the car had been marked for auction because the owner had signed it over. My father had sold my car to a wholesale auction for quick cash. When I confronted him, Denise was sitting on their new couch, this massive leather sectional that took up the entire living room. She was running her hands over it, talking about how perfect it was for their new life together. My father said the car was technically his since his name was on the title, and I wasn't using it enough to justify keeping it. I was literally home on break from college where I used it every single day. He said I could use the bus when I got back to school. Denise chimed in that young people were too attached to material things anyway. This woman who demanded new everything was telling me I was materialistic for wanting my own car that I'd paid for. My father said he'd done me a favor because now I wouldn't have to worry about maintenance and insurance. I reminded him I paid my own insurance and had just done all the maintenance over winter break. He said I was being ungrateful for all he'd done for me. He'd done nothing except put his name on a title. Denise said the money from my car had gone to good use, making their home beautiful for their blended family. Her kids, who were all older than me, hadn't contributed anything but were benefiting from my car being sold. They were sitting on the couch my car had paid for, taking photos for their social media about their mom's great taste in furniture. I called my mother crying and she said to let it go, that fighting with my father wasn't worth it. But then she called her brother Vincent, who was a lawyer. Vincent said what my father did was technically legal but morally reprehensible. He also said if I could prove I'd paid for the car entirely myself, I might have a case for theft by conversion. I had every receipt, every bank statement showing my deposits from my jobs, everything proving I'd bought that car myself. Vincent sent my father a letter saying we were prepared to take legal action. My father called, screaming that I was tearing apart his new family over a stupid car. Denise got on the phone saying I was a spoiled brat trying to ruin their happiness. Vincent told me to document everything they said. Then something amazing happened. The auction house called me because they'd found my college parking permit and some mail with my name in the glove compartment. They wanted to verify the sale was legitimate. I explained the situation, and they said the car hadn't sold yet. It was going up the next week. They couldn't stop the sale, but they told me when and where it would be. I couldn't afford to buy my own car back, but Vincent had an idea. He reached out to Denise's ex-husband, Carl, who was still bitter about the divorce. Carl was wealthy, owned a chain of restaurants, and hated that Denise had left him for my father, who had no money. Vincent told Carl about the couch situation, and Carl thought it was hilarious that my father had to sell his kid's car to afford furniture. Carl showed up at the auction and bought my car for $15,000, $3,000 more than it was worth, just to drive up the price. Then he called me and said I could have it back for exactly what I'd originally paid for it, $12,000. But I didn't have $12,000 anymore. Carl said I could work it off at his restaurants over the summer and take the car now. The best part was Carl knew Denise would recognize the car. He made sure to drive it past my father's house a few times before giving it to me. Denise saw it and demanded to know why Carl had my car. When she found out he'd bought it to give back to me, she lost it. She started screaming the second she saw Carl pull up in front of their house with my car. I wasn't there, but my father called me that night, and I could hear her in the background still yelling about it. He sounded tired when he asked me to return the car to keep the peace. I told him no. He said I was tearing apart his marriage over something that was technically his anyway. I reminded him the car was never his. He just had his name on a piece of paper, and I'd paid for every cent of it myself. He said Denise was having a breakdown over this, and I needed to be the bigger person. I asked him why I had to be the bigger person when he was the one who sold my car without asking. He hung up on me. The next morning, I was making coffee in my apartment when someone knocked on my door. I opened it, and my father was standing there with Denise right behind him. I hadn't given them my address, but my father must have gotten it from the college somehow. Denise pushed past him before I could say anything and walked right into my living room, looking around like she was inspecting it. My father followed her in, and I just stood there holding the door open, wondering if I should call someone. Denise started talking about how disrespectful I was being to their new family. She said they'd worked hard to build something beautiful together, and I was trying to destroy it out of spite. My father nodded along with everything she said, like he'd practiced this with her in the car. She actually told me I should be grateful they used my car money for something that benefits everyone instead of just me. I asked her how a couch in their house benefits me when I live 2 hours away at college. She said family is about sacrifice and sharing resources. I pointed out that her 3 kids, who were all older than me, didn't sacrifice anything. My father said this wasn't about them. Denise kept going about how the couch represented their commitment to blending their families and creating a welcoming space. I told her she could have created a welcoming space without stealing my car. She said I was being dramatic and that young people don't understand the value of investing in a home. This woman, who'd known my father for less than a year, was lecturing me about family values. My father finally spoke up and said, maybe we could work something out where I helped them with some bills and they'd help me get another car eventually. I told them both to leave. Denise said I'd regret burning bridges with my own father. I opened the door wider and waited until they walked out. That weekend, I drove to Carl's restaurant to start working off the $12,000. The place was bigger than I expected, a nice family restaurant with a full bar and an outdoor patio. Carl met me at the back entrance and showed me where to clock in. He introduced me to the kitchen manager, who set me up washing dishes and doing prep work. The work was honest and straightforward, nothing complicated about scrubbing pots and chopping vegetables. Carl came back during my break and told me I could pick up extra shifts if I wanted to pay things off faster and keep some spending money for school. He said his employees got fed before their shifts and the pay was fair. I worked 8 hours that day and my hands were raw by the end, but it felt good to be earning my car back properly. 2 weeks later, my father called while I was studying for finals. He sounded stressed right from the start, talking fast about their credit card payments killing them. He asked if I had any money I could loan them to help get through the month. I reminded him he'd literally just sold my car and spent the money on furniture. He got defensive, immediately saying that was different because Denise needed it for her mental health and their home environment. I asked him how buying a couch was a mental health treatment. He said I wouldn't understand because I'd never been married or had to blend a family. I told him I understood that he'd stolen from his own kid to buy something he couldn't afford. He said he wasn't asking for much, just enough to cover one payment so they didn't get hit with late fees. I told him no, and he called me selfish before hanging up. A few days later, I started seeing posts from Denise's oldest daughter on social media. She was tagging me in stuff about how some people can't let their parents be happy. Her siblings jumped in, agreeing with her in the comments. The middle one posted a photo of that stupid couch with a caption about family investments and how some people don't understand sacrifice. The post got dozens of comments from people who had no idea what actually happened. They were all talking about how beautiful the couch looked and how lucky Denise was to have such a supportive family. I wanted to comment and tell them the real story, but I knew that would just make things worse. One of Denise's kids shared another post about ungrateful children who think the world revolves around them. I got tagged in that one too. My roommate saw it and asked what was going on. I explained the whole situation and he said I should just block them all. I thought about it, but I wanted to see what they'd post next. Uncle Vincent called me a few days later. He said I could potentially sue for the difference between what my father got for the car at auction and its actual value. He also mentioned emotional distress as another angle. I thought about it for almost a week. The idea of dragging this out in court for years made me tired just thinking about it. I called him back and said I didn't want to do it. I told him I just wanted to move forward with my life and let my father deal with the mess he'd created. Vincent said he understood, but the option was always there if I changed my mind. My father tried a different approach about a month into my restaurant job. He called and said he was sorry about how things went down. He wanted to make it right by helping me with next semester's textbooks. I waited for the catch because I knew it was coming. He said he'd need me to tell Denise's kids to stop harassing me online first. I asked him why my forgiveness was conditional on making his life easier with his new family. He said it wasn't like that. He just thought if we could all move past this, then everyone would benefit. I told him I wasn't telling Denise's kids to do anything, and I didn't need his help with textbooks. He said I was being stubborn, and that family should be able to forgive each other. I reminded him that families shouldn't steal from each other in the first place. He got quiet for a minute, and then said he'd call me later. He didn't call back for 3 weeks. During a slow shift at the restaurant, Carl came over and leaned against the counter near the dish station. He asked how I was doing with everything, and I said I was managing. He started talking about his marriage to Denise and how she always needed the next new thing to feel happy. He said it started small with clothes and decorations, but then it was always something bigger. A new car, a kitchen remodel, a vacation they couldn't afford. He said watching my father make the same mistakes was like seeing a car crash in slow motion. He told me he bought my car back partly because he knows exactly how Denise operates and wanted to throw a wrench in her plans. He said she'd bleed my father dry within a year and then move on to someone else who could give her what she wanted. I asked him if he thought my father would figure it out. Carl laughed and said some people have to learn things the hard way. My mother called me one night while I was walking back to my apartment from the library. She said she needed to tell me something about my father. She sounded nervous, which wasn't like her. She told me he did similar stuff during their marriage, taking money from her savings for his own purchases without asking. She said once he used $3,000 she'd been saving for a new roof to buy a motorcycle he sold 6 months later. She said she should have warned me when I put his name on the title, but she'd hoped he'd changed. She didn't want to badmouth him to me because she thought parents shouldn't do that. I told her I wished she'd said something earlier. She said she knew that now, but at the time she really believed people could change. I was working a dinner shift the next week when I saw my father and Denise walk in. They got seated at a table in the back corner. I was in the kitchen, so they didn't see me, but I could watch them through the window. Denise kept gesturing dramatically with her hands, and my father just sat there looking exhausted. She was talking fast and loud enough that I could hear her voice, even though I couldn't make out the words. At one point, she got up and stormed out of the restaurant. My father sat there staring at his plate for at least 10 minutes. Finally, he left money on the table and walked out after her. The server who'd been taking care of their table came back to the kitchen and said they'd barely touched their food. She said the woman had been complaining about everything from the temperature to the music to the wait time, even though they'd only been there 20 minutes. Carl started giving me more responsibility around the 3rd week of working at the restaurant. He pulled me out of the dish pit during a slow Tuesday lunch shift and told me to shadow one of the servers for the rest of the day. The server was this woman named Rita, who'd been working there for 6 years and knew every regular customer by name. She showed me how to balance plates up my arm, how to read a table to know when they needed refills without hovering, and how to deal with difficult customers without losing my cool. By the end of the shift, she told Carl I was a natural, and he moved me to the floor permanently. The tips were way better than dishwashing wages. I started making an extra $100 or $150 a shift on busy nights, which meant I was paying down my car debt faster than I'd expected. Carl kept track of my payments in a little notebook he carried in his shirt pocket, and every week when I handed him cash, he'd write down the amount and tell me my new balance. By mid-June, I'd already paid off almost $4,000 and was feeling like I might actually get ahead of this whole situation. One night after closing, I was wiping down tables when I got a message on Instagram from someone I didn't recognize at first. The profile picture was blurry, and the username was just a bunch of random letters and numbers. I almost deleted it thinking it was spam, but then I saw the message preview mention my father's name. I opened it and saw it was from Denise's middle daughter, the one who'd posted that photo of the couch calling it a family investment. Her message was long and typed like she'd been thinking about it for a while. She said she was sorry for the social media posts and that her mom had basically made her and her siblings post that stuff to show they were a united family. She said things at home were getting really tense because money was tight, and her mom kept buying things they couldn't afford while my father stressed about credit card bills. She said she was starting to realize her mom had a problem with spending and that maybe selling my car had been wrong. I didn't know how to respond, so I just left it on red for a few days while I thought about it. Eventually, I sent back a short message saying I appreciated the apology and that I hoped things got better for her. She replied immediately asking if we could maybe get coffee sometime since we were close in age and she didn't really have anyone to talk to about the whole situation. I told her maybe after things calmed down, which was my polite way of saying probably never. The first week of July, I was working a dinner shift when my phone started buzzing in my locker. We weren't supposed to check phones during shifts, but it kept going off, so I asked Rita to cover my tables for a minute and went back to the break room. I had 7 missed calls from my father and 3 voicemails. The first voicemail was him saying he needed to talk to me as soon as possible. The second one, his voice sounded weird and shaky. The third one, he was crying. I'd never heard my father cry before, not when his own father died, not during the divorce from my mother. Never. I called him back and he answered on the first ring. He told me he'd lost his job that morning. His boss had called him into the office and said his performance had been slipping for months and they were letting him go. My father said he'd been distracted at work because of everything with Denise and the money problems, and now he didn't know what he was going to do. He said unemployment wouldn't cover half their bills, and Denise was freaking out about losing their lifestyle. He kept saying everything was falling apart and asking what he should do, like I was supposed to have answers for the mess he'd created. For the first time since this whole thing started, he actually sounded like he regretted what he'd done to me. He didn't say it directly, but I could hear it in his voice. This desperate sadness that made him sound smaller somehow. I told him I had to get back to work, and that he should probably start looking for a new job immediately. He said he would and thanked me for answering, which weird because my father never thanked me for anything. 2 days later, my phone exploded with notifications while I was sleeping in after a late shift. I grabbed it thinking something terrible had happened and saw I'd been tagged in a Facebook post by Denise. The post was this long rant about how I'd destroyed their family by being selfish and ungrateful. She wrote that my father had lost his job because of the stress I'd caused by taking legal action over a car that wasn't even legally mine. She said I was a spoiled brat who couldn't stand to see my father happy with someone new, and that I'd rather tear apart their blended family than let go of material possessions. She tagged a bunch of family members, including some of my cousins and aunts on my father's side, plus several of his friends from work and their old neighborhood. The post already had dozens of comments from people I barely knew, saying things like, they always knew I was trouble, or asking what kind of kid sues their own father. A few people defended me, saying they didn't know the whole story, but most of the comments were brutal. I took screenshots of everything and sent them to my mother and Uncle Vincent. My mother called immediately, saying this was out of control and asking if I was okay. Uncle Vincent called 10 minutes later and told me not to respond to anything and not to delete the screenshots. Uncle Vincent sent Denise a cease and desist letter that same day. He told me later he'd had his assistant draft it and get it sent by certified mail within 3 hours of me forwarding him the screenshots. The letter said Denise had committed defamation by making false public statements that damaged my reputation, and that if she didn't remove the post and issue a public apology within 24 hours, he would file a lawsuit on my behalf. He also sent a copy to my father with a note saying he was disappointed that my father had allowed his wife to publicly attack his own son. Denise took the post down that night and put up a new one saying she'd been emotional and upset about their financial situation, and that she apologized if her previous post had been hurtful or inaccurate. It was the most non-apology apology I'd ever seen, but Uncle Vincent said it was enough to avoid a lawsuit. He called me the next morning and said this was exactly what legal tools were for, protecting yourself from people who try to destroy your reputation when they're angry. He said knowing when to use those tools and when to let things go was part of being an adult, and that I was learning that lesson earlier than most people. I thanked him for handling it so fast, and he said that's what family does for each other, which made me think about how my father was also supposed to be family, but had let his wife trash me online without saying a word to stop her. Carl pulled me aside during a slow period in mid-July and asked if I had a minute to talk in his office. I thought maybe I'd messed up an order or gotten a customer complaint, but he seemed relaxed when we sat down. He said I'd been doing really good work, and that he'd noticed I was reliable and good with customers, even when things got stressful. He asked if I'd be interested in a permanent part-time position during the school year when I went back to college. He said the money would be decent, and he could work around my class schedule. Plus, if I kept developing my skills, he might move me into a shift supervisor role, which would look good on a resume. I told him I'd have to think about it because I didn't know how demanding my fall classes would be, but honestly I was already thinking yes. The money would help, and having real job experience in management would be way better than the random campus jobs most of my friends had. Carl said to let him know by the end of summer, and that the offer would stay open. He also mentioned he'd been impressed with how I'd handled everything with my father and Denise, saying a lot of people my age would have fallen apart or gotten bitter, but I just kept working and stayed focused. That actually meant something coming from him since he'd been through his own messy divorce with Denise and knew exactly how she operated. My father called again in early August, sounding even worse than before. He said he and Denise were 3 months behind on the mortgage, and his unemployment checks weren't enough to catch up. He said the bank had sent them a notice about foreclosure proceedings, and they might lose the house. Part of me felt bad because he was still my dad and I didn't want him to be homeless. But another part of me kept thinking about that $15,000 leather sectional sitting in their living room, taking up all that space while they couldn't pay their mortgage. I thought about how he'd sold my car without asking, how he'd let Denise trash me on Facebook, how he'd never once actually apologized for any of it. This was exactly what happened when you made terrible choices and kept making them instead of fixing the first problem. I told him I was sorry he was going through that, but I didn't know what he expected me to do about it. He said he wasn't asking for anything. He just wanted me to know what was happening. But I could hear in his voice he was hoping I'd offer to help. I made my final payment to Carl on the last Saturday of August. I'd been picking up extra shifts all month to get the last $800 paid off before school started. Carl counted the cash and wrote the final amount in his notebook, then pulled out the car title from his desk drawer. He'd already signed it over to me with just my name on it this time, no one else. He handed it to me and shook my hand and said I'd earned this car twice over. He said watching me handle this whole situation with maturity had made him wish his own kids had half my work ethic. His kids were older than me, and from what I'd heard, they both still lived off his money without working much. I thanked him for giving me the chance to earn my car back, and he said it had been good for his business too, since I'd turned into one of his better servers. He reminded me the part-time offer still stood for the school year, and I told him I'd definitely take it. We shook hands again, and I walked out to the parking lot holding the title with my name on it, feeling like I'd actually accomplished something real. My father called 2 days later, asking if I could help with one mortgage payment so they wouldn't lose the house. He said he'd been applying for jobs, but nothing had come through yet, and they were running out of time. I told him I needed to think about it and talk to some people first. I called my mother and she said it was my decision, but to be careful about getting pulled into their financial mess. I called Uncle Vincent, and he said if I did decide to help, I should make it very clear this was a one-time thing and get everything in writing. He said my father needed to understand there were conditions and consequences. I thought about it for a whole day and finally called my father back. I told him I'd give him $2,000 as a one-time thing, but I wanted it in writing that he'd pay me back. I also told him this was the only help he was getting, and if he or Denise ever came after my car or my money again, I was done completely. No more chances, no more family obligations, just done. He was quiet for a minute, and then said he understood and accepted my conditions. He actually sounded grateful instead of entitled for the first time in months. He said he'd made terrible choices trying to keep Denise happy, and that he should have protected my car instead of selling it. It wasn't a complete apology, but it was more accountability than I'd expected from him. I told him I'd bring the money by in a few days, and hung up feeling like maybe something had finally shifted between us, even if it was just a little bit. I drove over to his house 3 days later with the cash in an envelope. My father answered the door looking older somehow, like the last few months had aged him. He invited me in, and I followed him to the kitchen table where he had a handwritten contract ready. It was simple, just stating that I was lending him $2,000 for one mortgage payment, and he'd pay me back in monthly installments of $200 starting in October. He signed it, and I signed it, and I gave him the envelope. He counted the money twice, and then just sat there staring at it for a minute before putting it in his wallet. He thanked me, and said he knew he didn't deserve my help after what he'd done. I told him this was the last time, and he nodded, saying he understood completely. We sat there awkwardly for a few minutes, and then I left, feeling weird about the whole thing, but also like maybe we'd turned some kind of corner. The second week of September, my father called me while I was packing for school. He said he needed to tell me something and asked if I could come over. I drove to his house and found him sitting on the front steps instead of inside. He looked relieved when he saw me, almost lighter somehow. He said he and Denise were separating and she was moving in with her sister the next day. I asked if he was okay, and he said honestly, he felt better than he had in months. He said the constant pressure to spend money they didn't have was destroying him, and he couldn't keep living like that. He needed to figure out his life without someone always demanding more. Her kids were going with her, and he'd be alone in the house for the first time since they got married. I didn't know what to say, so I just sat down next to him on the steps. He said he was sorry again for selling my car and that he'd lost himself trying to make Denise happy. I told him I accepted his apology, but things were different now between us. He said he knew, and that he deserved that. I loaded up my car the next morning with everything I needed for fall semester. The trunk was full of clothes and books and my mini fridge, and the back seat had my desk lamp and printer and all the random stuff you need for a dorm room. I drove the 2 hours back to campus with the windows down and music playing, feeling different from I had in the spring. I had my car back with my name on the title. I had $3,000 in my savings account that I'd earned myself working at Carl's restaurants. I had actual job skills now and a part-time position waiting for me during the school year. The whole situation with my father still hurt when I thought about it, about how he'd betrayed me so easily for a stupid couch. But I also knew I'd stood up for myself when it mattered. I hadn't just let him take my car and get away with it. I'd fought back and won, and that made me feel stronger and more independent than before. The fall semester started and I kept my contact with my father limited. We texted every week or so, just checking in about basic stuff. He got a new job at a warehouse making decent money and was living alone in his house. Denise had taken most of the furniture she'd bought, including that massive couch, which I found funny. My father was sleeping on an air mattress and eating at his kitchen counter because he didn't have a table anymore. He didn't complain about it, though, just mentioned it in passing like it was what he deserved. We talked on the phone maybe twice a month and stuck to safe topics like my classes and his new job. Our relationship wasn't great and probably never would be like it was before, but we'd established clear boundaries about money and respect that didn't exist before. He knew if he ever crossed those lines again, I was done completely, and I think he believed me. Thanksgiving break came around and I drove home to my mother's house. She'd made a big dinner and invited Uncle Vincent and his family. We sat around the table eating and talking about normal stuff, and I realized how much stronger my relationship with my mother had gotten through all this. She'd stood up for me when it mattered by calling Vincent, and Vincent had used his legal knowledge to help me fight back. My father had sent me a text on Thanksgiving saying he was grateful I'd helped him with that mortgage payment and that he was working on paying me back. I thought about everything that had happened since spring break, about my car being sold and the fight to get it back and watching my father's marriage fall apart. I realized this whole mess had taught me something important about standing up for yourself. Sometimes that means watching people face consequences you didn't want for them, and that's okay, because you're not responsible for fixing their mistakes. I had my car and a good job and stronger relationships with the people who actually supported me. My relationship with my father was complicated now, but it was honest, and that was better than the fake peace we'd had before where he could take advantage of me and I'd just accept it.